this is actually really, this sort of prose version of this and a sort of poetic version of this. The prose version is Leon Wieseltier's review of this wonderful book, Zachor, by Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi. But the one I want to read is the one at the bottom. Chaim Hazaz was a Russian Jew who made Aliyah to Israel in the 1940s, and was an important writer. And this is his most important story. And it's a story. It's not even a story. In Hebrew, it was called hadrasha, which means the sermon or the drasha. And it's really just a speech. And this Jew, his name is Yudke, and Yudke is Yehuda, and Yehuda is Judah, or the Jew, stands up at a kibbutz meeting and says, I have something I want to say. Now, for those of you who never lived on a kibbutz is a collective settlement farm, and in the old days, before they had television, the most interesting thing they did is have meetings. And at these meetings, they would discuss ideology. They would start in Hebrew, they would move into Yiddish, and by 2 o'clock in the morning, they were screaming at each other in Russian, and they were discussing the ideology of Zionism, socialism, and Jewish history. So in the midst of this one schlepper who doesn't have an ideology, who doesn't have a philosophy, he's just a schlepper, he gets up and says, I want to say something. And they say, comrade, it's late, make it quick. And he says, okay, this is what I want to say. It's right here, look with me. Everyone see? I want to state, Yudke spoke with effort in low tense tones, that I am opposed to Jewish history. I will begin with the fact that we have no history at all. Because we didn't make our own history, the Goyim made it for us. Just as they used to put out our candles on Shabbat, milk our cows and light our ovens on Sabbath, so they made our history for us to suit themselves, and we took it from them as it came. It's not ours at all. That's a really interesting claim. To what extent is Jewish history the self-determination of the Jewish people, and to what extent is it what happened to us? In other words, to what extent are we the subjects of our history or the objects of our history? How many of you, don't raise your hand because I don't want to embarrass you, went to the same Hebrew school I did where you could name every tyrant who ever killed Jews? Right? From Haman to Pharaoh to Nebuchadnezzar to Titus to Vespasian to Torquemada. I mean, it was the history of Jewish persecution. And I was a fourth grader. The history of Jewish persecution. And that was what your Jewish... So he says, you know what? If that's going to be your history, I don't want to hear it. And it's a very interesting claim that he's saying. That's not what history is. Right? Because we didn't make it. We would have made it differently. We didn't want it to be that way. It was others who wanted it that way, and they forced it on us. Just think, he says, what's in it? Oppression, defamation, persecution, and martyrdom. And again, oppression, defamation, persecution, and martyrdom. Again and again and again without end. That's what's in it. It bores you to death. It's just plain dull. It's just plain dull. At least you can say it's uninteresting. Our children love to read. They read. But what do they read? They read historical novels about Goyim. Right? Not about Jews. Why is it so? It's no accident. It's simply because Jewish history is dull. It has no glory or action or heroes or conquerors, no rulers or masters to their fate. Just a collection of wounded, hunted, groaning, wailing wretches, always begging for mercy. I would simply forbid teaching our children Jewish history. Why the devil teach about our ancestors' shame? I would say, boys, from the day we were driven our land, we've been a people without history. Class dismissed, go out and play football. Boy, I wish I went to his Hebrew school. This is a very powerful claim. Now, first of all, this is classical Zionism. Classical Zionism said, history is the story of a people's self-determination, a people's formation of its own culture and its own way of life. To the extent that we are the objects of history and not its subject, it's not a story we want to learn. So in classical Zionist school curriculum, you learn the Bible, you learn the story of the Maccabees, then you turn the page in your textbook, and the next page was Theodor Herzl and the rise of the Zionist movement. And the entire, everything from 166 BCE until 1897 was gone. Why? Because it was this history. Because it was this history. You see? Now the question is, what is it in that history that we need to learn? And what is it in our history that we need to learn? How do you create a new myth? This was classical Zionism. This was a rejection of Jewish history because they wanted a different story. All right, so now we have a country. What is that? How does that change? What is our myth now that we have a country? And all of the great questions that we ask about what is our relationship to that country? What is our relationship to that land? What is our relationship to brothers and sisters around the world? This is what we mean when we say we have to seek a new myth, a new story that defines Jewish identity. That's your homework assignment. You have 15 weeks. It's due in the end of February. I'm going to grade very carefully. But that's what we're going to be looking for as we listen to the story of all of the previous ages of Jewish history. Let's take a moment. We have a few moments, and I usually don't do this, but we're going to actually have some questions and answers. So if anybody has a question they want to ask, I'm just going to ask you to try to make it a question and not a sermon. If you want to give a sermon, you're really welcome to do that. Any rabbi in the town would love to have you give a sermon. Just tell them you're from VBS. Douglas.
Hi, Rabbi. I wanted to ask you a question about the myth of American Judaism in the sense that this is the first time in our history that we may be loved to death.
Yeah, isn't that nice? They used to want to kill us, now they want to kiss us.
Is it? I mean, that's the question. Is it nice? Is it good for us? Or are we going to be like German Americans or Polish Americans or Italian Americans?
I read something this week which I really loved. I'll tell you, it's not a good answer to your question, but it's as good an answer as I got. So you know the newspaper, The Forward? Yeah. It used to be a Yiddish newspaper, now it's in English, right? You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. So The Forward had a really interesting project. Somebody asked 17 rabbis, what's the greatest challenge facing the Jewish people today? It was really interesting. And 16 of the answers you could have predicted. 60 of the 16 answers, 10 of them said assimilation, intermarriage, disaffection, apathy, ignorance, people disaffected from their Judaism. 5 of them said Islamic fundamentalism, Hamas, Hezbollah. One of them said Jewish fundamentalism, the ultra-Orthodox. And one kid, and I happen to love him because he was my student. I take full credit. One kid answered like this. He said, the biggest challenge facing our Judaism right now is that's the question that you asked me. The question isn't what's the biggest challenge facing us now. The question is how can we thrive as a community? You see, instead of asking the question, how did we survive as a Jewish people, which is the way I put it at the end of the first half, maybe the proper question ought to be, under what conditions does Jewish life thrive? Under what conditions does Jewish life become its most creative? Under what conditions and how does one engineer the creativity? How does one focus the cultural creativity and resilience of this people? Douglas, as the great Rabbi Chaim Dickens once wrote in his famous novel, A Tale of Two Shtetlach, it is the best of times and it's the worst of times. Right now in the Jewish world, there is no community in the world, no Jewish community in the world that is in imminent danger of existential elimination. And you could have never said that even a few years ago. Every Jewish community in the world, now there are places where it's dangerous to walk around with a yarmulke on, right? France, right? But there's no community in the world right now where Jews are in imminent danger of being annihilated. That's an amazing fact. And then here in America, we've never had it so good. We have never had more security, more freedom, more power, more influence. Do you understand that the two people who ran for president of the United States in the previous election, both of their children are married to Jews? Do you know that? You know that 50 years ago, 30 years ago, what that would have done? I mean, did you understand what it means that the president's daughter, Shomer Shabbos and Shomer Mitzvahs? It means that when she's on Yontif, he's tweeting. That's what it means. You know? I wish she were reformed. I mean, the country might be safer. But this is inconceivable. When I was a kid, they told me which colleges not to apply to because they don't take enough Jews. You'll never get in. Princeton. They said, don't bother going to Princeton. They said, why not? I want to go to Princeton. No, Princeton don't like Jews. Dartmouth don't like Jews. The president of Princeton is Jewish. Just unbelievable, right? So, the best of time, and at the same time, you know, every demographic study of the American Jewish community would make you, gives you a headache and turns your stomach, right? So it's the best of times and the worst of times. The question is now, how do you take what's the best of times and find the cultural creativity to address those other issues? That's what I spend all my days doing. That's this question of what's the guiding myth that we're looking for? What's the story we can tell? Okay? That's exactly the question. You have 2 daughters in Berkeley. Tell me what you say to them. Okay? Not now. Some other time. Okay? Thank you. Who has the microphone? Please.
Are we descendants of the Khazars?
I'm sorry, what?
Are we descendants of the Khazars? You mentioned them, and there's a lot of people who say we are.
Yeah, there is a theory. There's a theory which is not widely held, but it was put out there that Ashkenazic Jewry are descendants of the Khazars. Right? First of all, I'm not sure the Khazars really existed. Number 2, I'm not sure they became Jewish. Number 3, if they did become Jewish, how were the descendants of them? I guess you got to go on ancestry.com and do your DNA and find out what percentage. You're Litvak, so I know because I can tell. You know what percentage of your Litvak blood is actually Khazar, right? For Halevi, he was a medieval, so for him historical facts were not that important. He was interested in myth, because the notion that a kingdom converted to Judaism gave his people the strength to withstand the attacks, the viciously anti-Jewish attacks, first of the Muslim community, then of the church. So this became a spiritual pillar of strength for that community. It wasn't, whether or not it really existed is not as important as what it did for them. That is, it became myth, not history. And in that sense, we are the descendants of the Khazars. And that story helped sustain us through some very difficult historical times. Okay?
Because today we refer to as fake Jews.
Fake Jews? Who says you're a fake Jew? Listen, I give too much money to the UJA to be a fake Jew. I know you. I know you're not a fake Jew. Why would you let anybody tell you you're a fake Jew? Nah, come on. Look, listen, if they're gonna question, you don't let the internet do that. You let your rabbi do that. You know, you don't let the internet insult your Jewishness. That's my job. They pay me a lot of money to insult your Jewishness. You don't let some stranger on the internet do that. I'm good at this. I'm a professional. I know how to do it. You know. Who had the mic? Who has the mic? Where are you? Stand up. Stand up. Michael, stand up.
Yeah, as a Goldstein, I feel I've been designated to receive a lot of junk mail from Jewish organizations. So, I guess my question relates to what you were saying, which is that, again, from the Yiddish Book Center, or the ADL, the Brit, I think we probably get pieces of junk mail a day. So I guess my question to you is so what are these defense organizations defending, and how do they answer that question that you're asking?
That's a very good question. Most of these defense organizations, there are Jewish, let me just define what he's asking. So there's a set of Jewish organizations in the community that were established, many of them were established earlier in the 20th century, to protect Jews against attacks from outside, from prejudice, discrimination, hatred, and anti-Semitism. And with the waning of anti-Semitism, many of these organizations have taken other kinds of agendas on. It's sort of the March of Dimes problem. Remember the March of Dimes? The March of Dimes was a beautiful charity, and its purpose was to eliminate polio. And then one day, to the utter chagrin of the March of Dimes, they eliminated polio. So the organization should have dissolved, but they decided instead that it was too good an organization to dissolve. So they chose a different cause. Now they're talking about birth defects, right? So what's happened is that most of the defense organizations, certainly the ADL, and to an extent the AJC, and to some extent the Wiesenthal Center, have broadened their purview. Instead of just hatred against Jews, they've taken on the whole question of tolerance. They've taken on the whole question of hatred. There's still a good deal of anti-Semitism in the world, thank you very much. But the real question is, are all of the outbreaks of intolerance, of all the outbreaks of hatred and prejudice in the world, and many of these organizations, the ADL, for example, now has a wonderful curriculum that's being run in public schools all over the country on differences, on tolerating differences. It's a very powerful curriculum. AJC has taken on certain conversations about democracy in the country. The Wiesenthal Center, the Wiesenthal Center is sort of ground zero for teaching people what it means to live with other people who are different than themselves, and that becomes the focus of these organizations. I get the same mail you do. One of them, I don't know which one, I forget which one. One of them has a nasty habit of sending the mail in big black envelopes and with giant red letters about the murder of Jews across the world. And the only one that it scares is my mailman. You know? No, he's a sweet guy, and he stops me and he says, "Rabbi, are you okay?" You know? And I say, "I'm fine." He says, "It says here, murder Jews. We're really worried about you." I said, "That's really sweet of you, but I think we'll do fine." So the poor guy, you give him a heart attack, you know? And I understand they're trying to raise money, and there's a sort of an alarmist attitude by it. But the really wonderful work that these organizations have done now is to sort of broaden it. Take the Jewish experience now becomes representative of a more general American experience of intolerance, discrimination, and hatred. And that's, I think, I think that's a very valuable campaign. I think it positions the Jewish people of America in a very interesting place. Who's got the mic? Yes, please. Can you stand up so I can see you? I'm sorry.
First of all, I would like to thank you for all the information you provided.
Well, thank you.
Appreciate it. Secondly, with all the prosecution, with all the discrimination that has been exerted on Jews, specifically and in general, in the war, what's going on with all the killing, why God created human beings? Because we are worse than animals.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to say that. The reason I said that because with the intelligence that we have, the brain, the mind we have, which is superior to the animals, we are doing worse than the animals that they do to themselves.
Yeah. I feel that way sometimes too. I read the morning paper and I say the same thing, right? In my theology, God created human beings and gave us choice. We have choices, right? I can give you the science lesson. It goes like this. There have been dogs on this planet for 50 million years, and no dog ever woke up in the morning and said meow. Not one, ever. No dog ever woke up and said, "Today I'm going to be a porpoise or a platypus or a porcupine." Dogs are dogs. You can teach an old dog new tricks, but you can't teach a dog to be anything but a dog. You and I wake up in the morning and we have a choice. We have a choice. We get to determine our own character. We are the only self-creating creature in nature. Because we do have a nature. There is such thing as constitutional traits of personality. But fundamentally, we get to decide the kind of people we are. Because not only are we biological creatures, we're moral creatures. And as a moral creature, I make a choice about the way that I'm going to speak to the other, the way that I'm going to talk to my friend, the way that I'm going to talk to my wife, the way that I'm going to spend my money, the way that I'm going to drive. I choose my character. Okay? Now, here's the question. The question is, how do you create... Now, given the fact that we make these choices, okay, it would be nice to believe that each of us have goodness deep down in our hearts. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the great Enlightenment philosopher, believed that every human being was born good and only culture makes us evil. That's because he never worked as a counselor in a Jewish summer camp. I worked as a counselor in a Jewish summer camp. And I can tell you this, the most dangerous creature on this planet is not the great blue shark, It's not the Bengal tiger. It's not the python of the Amazonian jungle. The greatest, most dangerous creature on this planet is a bunk of 11-year-old girls. Because what they do is on the first day of camp, they pick one completely at random, and then they eat her to death the whole summer. Because kids are mean. They just are. They do this. Now the question is, how do you take that? Because we're not basically good. We're not basically evil either. We're basically morally neutral, and we make decisions as situations arise. The question is, how do you teach conscience? How do you teach goodness? How do you create a cultural circumstance in which people choose compassion and empathy and healing instead of competition and hatred and rejection? How do you create a community which is devoted to those ideals? That is the question of the Torah. That is the question at the heart of the Torah tradition. How do you create a culture of compassion so that people choose to live with compassion, choose to regard the other as valuable and precious as themselves? How do you teach ethics? That's the great question. Now, the bottom line of the Torah tradition, and I can tell you this now because we just started reading the Torah. Last week was Parshat Breshit. We're right at the beginning. You're not too late. This is the year. You could read the whole thing. You start now. God never gives up on us. That's the great tradition of the Torah. No matter how evil we are, no matter how disgusting we are, and you said it, exactly right. I mean, my God, this guy who takes a gun to a 38th floor window in Las Vegas and blows away innocent people who come for a music concert, my God, you say, you know, and the guys who make the bump stock thing that makes it possible for the lunatic to shoot more people, you know, and the people who sold him the rifles, you know, the 43 assault rifles, and the Congress that allows a person to own 43 assault rifles, and you say to yourself, my God. Okay, fine. So that's what people do. And yet, the wonderful bottom line, the sort of moral of the story, of the Torah story is, we're not done yet. Turn the page. We'll try harder tomorrow. That kind of faith in the capacity of human beings to choose anew, that's the deep faith of the Torah tradition. One of the things that we're going to see is how that Torah tradition is translated into communal imperatives and communal structures over the course of Jewish history, but it all has the same purpose, which is the purpose you've articulated. How do I create gentle, compassionate, loving, giving, healing, helping people? How do I create people who live godly lives? That's the question of Jewish history. And that's what we're going to start next week, Professor Myers. We'll see each other next week. Thank you.